Okay, so now we start our investigation of John Rawls. Here's a photo. John Rawls would be the most influential political philosopher of the 20th century, in a way because he really reinvigorated political philosophy. At the time that he was writing, lots of people in philosophy thought that political philosophy was basically impossible. We needn't go into why, but basically the idea was that one couldn't make meaningful claims about political philosophy. And he turned this around with a style of investigation called reflective equilibrium, which I'll just mention here in passing, because we'll see that it's an important part of his style of reasoning. There's two ways generally of thinking about how one might do any kind of philosophy. I mean, there's more than two, but there's two nicely contrasting ways. One is foundationalism, in which what you do is you try and find some founding principles, founding ideas that perhaps you can prove to be true or at least establish in some strong way. And then you develop all your theory from those foundations. And foundationalism has a long history in philosophy, but I think it's widely accepted that it hasn't been very successful because basically we human beings are fallible. We keep getting things wrong, and in particular we keep getting the foundations wrong. So it's wonderful philosophies. I mean, I think, I spent my youth studying them, and I wouldn't change things for the world. They begin with these foundations and build this huge theory out of them. And I'm thinking mainly of, say, 19th century, 18th, 19th century philosophy. And it's spectacular stuff. It's wonderful. But the problem is that the foundations are almost always incorrect. And so as a result, the philosophy is problematic. And what Rawls does is something quite different, and that he says, well, we don't have any foundations. What we have to do is to achieve wide reflective equilibrium with our thinking. Now what does that mean? A reflective equilibrium, first of all, it has to be reflective. So we're not just dealing with our gut instincts. We have to start with our gut instincts, but we can't just stick with it. We've got to reflect on things. We've got to examine things. We've got to subject them to analysis, to criticism, to see whether they can survive criticisms that other people make or that we make, and so on. What we want to do is we want to make sure that our beliefs cohere with the other beliefs that we have. And we want to do that as widely as possible. So that's the idea of wide reflective equilibrium. So what we say about political philosophy should cohere with what we say about philosophy of language, and what we say about the philosophy of the mind, and what we know about physics, and what we know about biology and chemistry, and what we know about economics, and what we know about, and so on, right? You were trying to achieve a wide reflective equilibrium. Okay, and in this way, he thought that he could do political philosophy without being foundationalist, without starting with some foundational ideas. In 1971, Rawls published the book that we're going to be examining in these lectures. The book is called A Theory of Justice. And it's without question the most important piece of political philosophy of the 20th, not just the 20th century, since, I don't even know, since Hobbes, maybe, at least since Mill. And in this book, Rawls presents his position by contrasting it with two theories, one, intuitionism, that we haven't examined and I won't say anything about, but the other, utilitarianism, which we have examined. And his central claim about utilitarianism, and remember this includes not just Bentham but Mill and the neoclassical economists, his central claim about this approach is it fails to take seriously the distinction between persons. So this is a kind of a slogan that he has for capturing what is the difference, the central difference he thinks between utilitarianism and his approach. He thinks utilitarianism does not take seriously the distinction between persons. Okay, now that might not mean much to you at the moment, but we're going to go on and see. The point of this episode is to show you exactly what he meant by that. Okay, so his view is that morality has to take into account the fact that each person is a locus of value in their own right. So I have value, you have value, we each have value in our own right. And we're not valuable merely because of the preferences or pleasures that we have. And his claim is that utilitarianism can't do this. Utilitarianism values our pleasures, that Bentham, or our preferences, Pareto, but it can't value us. It can't value who we are for ourselves. It can't take account of the fact that we are sources of value ourselves. Now, in demonstrating his position in a theory of justice, Rawls uses the kinds of graphs that a neoclassical economist might. And I won't go through all of that, but I've just tried to simplify the kind of picture that he's presenting here with these slides, which I hope are helpful. So here's the first slide that demonstrates the difference between Rawls's approach and Bentham's. So we have here an initial position and a subsequent position. So just imagine here we have a society of three people, A, B, and C. And in the initial position, they each have 10 units of utility each. Well, 10 units of whatever, but let's just say 10 units of utility each. And they move to a second position in which A and B have nothing and C has 31 units. Okay, now the key thing to see here is that the total goes from the initial position 30 to the subsequent position 31. So for Bentham, what we have here is an increase in net utility. And so Bentham would say that this move from the initial to the subsequent position is an improvement. But Rawls says that it isn't. Rawls says that we can see here that Bentham's utilitarianism is failing to take seriously the distinction between persons. And why is that? Because it completely ignores the fact that A and B have lost everything while C has gained a lot. It focuses entirely on the totals, but it ignores the position of A, B, and C. And Rawls says, here we can see very clearly the failure of utilitarianism to take seriously the distinction between persons, because it's only interested in the net aggregate utility, right, the total. It's not interested in A or B, right? But, says Rawls, a genuine theory of justice needs to take into account the fact that we are dealing with people here, right? That A, B, and C are separate persons, and that needs to go into our calculation. Focusing simply on the total fails to do this. Now, you may have noticed that example that I presented in the slide is not a compelling argument against Mill and the neoclassical economists, because they would not accept that the move from the initial to the subsequent position is justified. Right? Mill would say that the move from the initial to the subsequent position harms A and B, and so therefore it can't be justified, at least it can't be coerced, it can't be forced to be brought about, and it wouldn't happen, right, if the parties were left on their own, because as the neoclassical economists would say, A or B would never freely agree to enter into transactions that would end them up with zero. And the neoclassical economists would also say that the move between the initial to the subsequent position is not a Pareto superior move, because remember, to be Pareto superior, or to be Pareto efficient, as we're inclined to say today, the move has to make at least one person better off and no one worse off. Well, obviously that move isn't Pareto superior, because it makes A and B worse off. And so, okay, says Rawls, okay, that's fine. Let me give you another example. So here we still have our three-person society with A, B, and C in it, and we have an initial position in which each of them have 10 units of whatever it is. Okay, and then we have an option. We could move to the first option, or we could move to the second option. So we have a choice between these two. And the question is which we should choose. In the first option, A and B remain in the same position, and C gets markedly better off. Whereas in the second, if we choose the second option, A, B, and C all get better off. And notice that the totals are the same. Right, the total is 120 in each case. Now, the what we need to see here is that neither Mill nor Pareto would give us any reason for choosing one of these options rather than the other one. In neither case is anyone made worse off, and so in neither case is anyone harmed. So Mill would be happy either way, and also in neither case is anyone made worse off. So people are made better. At least one person is made better off, and nobody is made worse off. So both the move to the first and the second option are Pareto superior. And so as far as the neoclassical utilitarians go, as far as Mill goes and as far as Pareto goes, we could go either way. We could choose option 1 or we could choose option 2, the first option or the second option. It doesn't make any difference. But Rawls says this too fails to take seriously the distinction between individuals. Rawls argues that the second option is on its face preferable to the first, because in the second option, the increase in wealth or utility or whatever it is shared fairly as between the members of that society. And that's significant, Rawls thinks, and it's wrong for a theory of justice simply to ignore that, as utilitarianism does. The fact that A and B get made better off under the second option but not the first is something that we ought to consider. So even though the neoclassical position, the position of Mill and Pareto, is not focused on the totals, it's still not, in Rawls's view, giving sufficient attention to the fact that we're dealing with three separate individuals here. Yes, it says nobody should be made worse off. Nobody should be harmed in Mill's case. Nobody should be made worse off in Pareto's case. But still, it turns out that we are failing to adequately take into account the fact that we're dealing with three individuals, each of which have moral worth in themselves. And we're doing this because the focus is in the wrong place. And the key thing here is that Rawls is saying that justice is not simply about making sure that things get better. Justice is about making sure that things are distributed fairly. And this is something that, according to Rawls, neoclassical utilitarianism fails to understand. What its focus, neoclassical utilitarians' focus, is on making things better. But Rawls says, no, that's not what the focus should be. The focus should be on making sure that things are distributed fairly. Now, this goes right back to where we started with utilitarianism, where I said that one of the most powerful things about utilitarianism is it's based on this idea that the right thing to do is to make the world a better place. The right thing to do is to make people's lives go better. And Rawls is saying that though that sounds good, it's actually wrong. It's wrong because the focus should not simply be on making things better than they are now. We must be trying to make things better than they are now in a just way. And that requires us to make sure that when we make things better, that improvement is fairly shared amongst the members of the society. And that, Rawls thinks, is something that utilitarianism misses out. Now, one thing I do want to say before we end this talk is something that's going to become important later and something that we will revisit. But Rawls's focus is not on welfare. So I've been talking in this episode about units of utility and so on. That's because we were comparing Rawls with the utilitarians. But Rawls himself is not focused on units of utility. He's focused on resources. Right? He's going to talk about the distribution of resources, the fair distribution of resources in society. Now, one of the things that's important about this is it means that the worries, the problems that we had about the focus on utility evaporates. We don't have a problem measuring utility in Rawls because he's not interested in utility. He's interested in resources. So we've gone from, with Bentham, the need to develop a utilitometer, to ordinal rankings of utility in the neoclassical economists, and Pareto in particular. And now we've left utility behind and we're focusing on resources. Now, why we've done this and the importance of it is something that we'll revisit later. But that will do for this episode. In the next episode, we're going to go on to talk about Rawls' social contract argument.